The car was quiet when it shouldn't have been. Rosalie sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the dashboard screen show a name she recognized, Pascal, and a call timer that had been running for nearly 2 minutes. Hugo was standing just outside the driver's door, his back half turned, his phone pressed to his ear. He hadn't noticed. He'd stepped out to take the call and hadn't thought to check whether the Bluetooth had disconnected from the car's speakers first. It hadn't. Pascal's voice came through clearly, a little muffled by the wind outside. "So are you actually going to propose? Or are you going to keep putting it off?" Hugo said something she couldn't quite catch. The wind took it. "You love her or you don't, Hugo. That's not complicated." A pause. Then Hugo's voice, closer now, turned back toward the car. "It's not that simple." "Then, explain it to me." Rosalie sat very still. Outside, a transport truck pulled into the rest stop off Highway 11, and its headlights swept briefly across the windshield. She didn't blink. "Every time we go somewhere," Hugo said, "I'm doing the math before we even get there. Are there steps? Is it too dark? Can she manage the distance from the parking lot? And if something goes wrong, I'm the one who has to. What's it?" "I don't know," he exhaled. "Some days I feel like her handler more than her." "Her what?" "I don't know what I feel like. That's the problem." "Does she ask you to do all that?" Hugo didn't answer right away. On the dashboard, the call timer read 2:47. Rosalie reached forward and pressed the end call button. The screen went dark. She leaned back in her seat and looked out the side window at the gray October tree line, at the gas station sign glowing amber at the far end of the lot, at the sky that was already starting to dim, even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. Her vision had always been worse in low light. She'd learned to notice the dimming earlier than other people did. A few minutes later, Hugo opened the driver's door and climbed in. He set 2 paper coffee cups in the console between them. "Sorry, the line was longer than I thought." He put the car in reverse. "We should still make it to my parents for dinner if we..." "Don't," Rosalie said. He looked at her. "Don't what?" She didn't turn her head. "Don't take me to your parents' house." The car idled. Hugo's hand stayed on the gear shift. "Rosalie, take me to the lake instead." He opened his mouth, then closed it. After a moment, without asking which lake, he pulled out of the rest stop and drove north. She had known Hugo Brandt for 2 years and 4 months. She'd met him on a Tuesday evening in late spring, at a community choir rehearsal in a church hall on Barrington Street in Halifax. She wasn't in the choir. She'd gone to play accompaniment for a friend who had dropped out after the first rehearsal, leaving Rosalie alone at the upright piano in the corner, with a folder of sheet music printed in 18-point font. Hugo was the sound volunteer for the evening, a compact man with careful hands who spent 20 minutes repositioning a microphone stand before he seemed satisfied with it. He'd noticed the large print sheet music before he noticed much else about her. "Is that a vision thing?" he'd asked, not unkindly during the break. "Retinitis pigmentosa," she said. "Since I was 28. He nodded the way people did when they were filing information away carefully, not dismissing it. "Does it affect the playing?" "The reading more than the playing. I've had most of it memorized since I was 12. He smiled at that. "That's either very impressive or very terrifying." "Both," she said, and turned back to the piano. She was 33 by the time they started dating properly. She taught kindergarten music at a public school in the north end of the city, a job she'd had to restructure twice since her diagnosis. Larger monitors, adjusted classroom lighting, a teaching assistant during the sessions where she needed to move around the room. Her condition wasn't degenerative in the way people imagined when they heard the word. She hadn't gone dark, but the peripheral vision was gone on the left side now, and the right was narrowing slowly, and reading anything below 14-point font required her to hold the page close enough that it looked like she was trying to memorize it by smell. She drove during the day only, on familiar routes. She'd stopped driving at night 2 years before she met Hugo. The things she no longer did were numerous and mostly quiet. She'd stopped performing piano at recitals, not because she'd lost the ability but because dim stages and unfamiliar layouts unnerved her, and the thought of stumbling in front of an audience had lodged itself somewhere in her chest and refused to move. She'd stopped reading her mother's recipe notebook, a small cloth-covered book filled with her mom, Diane's cramped, looping handwriting, because she simply couldn't make out the letters anymore. Diane had died the previous spring. Suddenly, a brain aneurysm, no warning, And the notebook had gone into a drawer in Rosalie's kitchen, where she sometimes opened it and held it without reading it. She'd also stopped planning the train trip she and Diane had talked about for years, the one through the Rockies that ended somewhere in British Columbia, where you could, if the timing was right, drive north and stand in an open field and watch the northern lights fill the sky. Hugo knew about all three. She'd told him on a Sunday morning in his apartment, drinking coffee by the window, the way couples tell each other the shapes of the things they've lost. He'd listened carefully. That was what she'd loved first about him, the way he listened like he was memorizing something. 3 months after that conversation, he came to her apartment with a paper bag and a specific expression on his face, the one he wore when he was trying not to look pleased with himself. Inside the bag was a vinyl record in a sleeve he'd reinforced with cardboard, a Chopin Nocturne, Opus 9, No. 2, recorded in 1971 by a Polish pianist whose name Rosalie had been trying to track down for years, a pressing that had gone out of production before she was born. Hugo had found it through a record collector in Montreal, who'd found it through another collector in Warsaw. Rosalie held the sleeve for a long time without speaking. "The cover's a bit water-damaged on the corner," Hugo said, "but the record itself is fine. I had it cleaned." She ran her thumb along the warped edge of the sleeve. "Where did you even start looking?" "Online, then not online," he shrugged. "It took a while." She played it that evening on the old turntable she kept on the bookshelf, and when the music came through the speakers, she sat on the floor in the middle of the room and didn't say anything at all. Hugo sat beside her. They didn't touch. They just listened. That was the version of him she'd believed in. The other version arrived gradually, the way most things do. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even unkind most of the time. It was a series of small decisions made on her behalf before she'd been asked. He'd rearranged her kitchen one afternoon while she was at work, moved the glasses from the upper cabinet to the lower shelf, repositioned the cutting board, placed a rubber mat on the counter by the stove. She'd come home to find everything slightly wrong, and when she'd asked, he said he'd read something about reducing trip hazards in low-vision households. She moved everything back the following morning without telling him. He'd declined a dinner invitation from her colleague Ren on her behalf, telling Ren that Rosalie wasn't sure about the restaurant's layout. Rosalie found out 3 weeks later when Ren mentioned it in the staff room, puzzled why she'd never received a response. In February, Hugo hadn't told her about the email from the Halifax Music Conservatory, asking if she'd be interested in returning to do a recital in the spring, a small, 40-seat room with good lighting, the kind of space she could actually navigate. He'd seen the email on her laptop while she was in the shower, and without saying anything to her, had replied that she wouldn't be available. Rosalie found the sent message in her outbox 6 weeks later by accident, looking for something else. She'd asked him about it calmly. He said he thought the stage would be too much for her, that he'd been protecting her from a situation that might go badly. "You could have asked me," she said. "I didn't want to put you in the position of having to say no to something you'd feel guilty about." She looked at him for a long time. "That's not your decision to make." He'd apologized. She'd believed it. In September, just weeks before the highway rest stop, Hugo was offered a 3-month contract with a music festival in Vancouver. Sound design, good money, the kind of work he'd been wanting for years. He turned it down without telling her. She found out from his friend Marco, who assumed she already knew. When she asked Hugo, he said, "I couldn't leave you here for 3 months. Did you ask me if I needed you to stay?" He hadn't. "I have a support worker through CNIB twice a week," she said. "I have Adrian 10 minutes away. I can manage my own groceries." "I know that." "Then why didn't you ask me?" He didn't have a good answer. She could see him reaching for one, turning it over, discarding it. The drive to the lake took 40 minutes. Hugo pulled into a gravel lot at the edge of a provincial park, empty this late in the season. He turned off the engine and didn't speak. The lake was gray in the October light. The trees along the far shore had mostly dropped their leaves. Rosalie looked at it for a while. "How much did you hear?" Hugo asked. "Enough." He turned toward her. "I meant what I said to Pascal, that I love you. That part was true." "I know." "Then, you also said you feel like my handler." She kept her voice even. "And that you're tired, and that you didn't sign up for this." He pressed his hands flat on his thighs. "I was frustrated. I was venting to my brother. That's not. It's the truest thing you've said to me in months." She turned to look at him then. His face was tight, The way faces got when someone was trying to hold two opposing things at once. You've been making decisions for me because you're exhausted by something I never asked you to do, and then carrying that exhaustion in silence and letting it grow into something that sounds like resentment. That's not fair. The conservatory, she said. Vancouver, Ren's dinner, my kitchen. He was quiet. I'm not angry with you, Rosalie said. I need you to understand that. I'm not angry. But I've been living inside a version of my own life where my choices were being quietly managed by someone who loves me, and I didn't fully see it until I heard your voice through those speakers. She reached into her bag, which sat at her feet. Inside, wrapped in a small cloth she'd tucked around it that morning without knowing quite why, was the vinyl record. She placed it on the console between them. I'm giving this back to you. Hugo looked at the water-damaged sleeve. Rosalie, you spent weeks looking for it. That was real. Keep it. I don't want it back. Hugo, she said his name quietly without cruelty. I need you to go. He sat there for a moment longer. Then he nodded, a small motion, and looked back at the lake. He drove her home. They didn't speak for most of the way. When he pulled up in front of her building on Roby Street, she got out carefully, one hand on the doorframe the way she always did. He didn't get out to help. She hadn't asked him to. She went upstairs and sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long while. Then she turned on the light, made tea, and opened her laptop. The weeks after were not easy, and she didn't pretend they were. Hugo collected his things on a Saturday morning while she was at her sister Adrian's place. When she came home, the apartment felt the way a room feels when a piece of furniture has been removed, the same size but wrong somewhere. The hook where he used to hang his jacket was still near the door. The vinyl record was on the bookshelf, where she'd put it the night she came home from the lake. She'd brought it back up with her. It was hers. She'd decided that on the drive home quietly. She started attending her CNIB appointments more consistently and being honest with her support worker, a steady woman named Colette, about what she was and wasn't managing. Colette helped her set up a screen reading system she'd been meaning to configure properly for 2 years. It wasn't complicated. She just needed a reason that was fully her own. She called the conservatory. The spring recital slot was gone, but there was a smaller community concert in February, 40 seats, flexible lighting, a coordinator already familiar with accessibility requirements. Rosalie said yes before she finished reading the email. The recipe notebook took longer. She brought it to a digitization service that worked with a low-vision accessibility program through the public library. A technician there photographed each page and ran it through a handwriting transcription process, then formatted the output at 18-point font on white paper, 1 recipe per page. The process took 3 weeks. When Rosalie picked up the folder, she sat in the library's quiet reading room and opened to the first page. Diane's words were there, not the cramped loops she'd been holding in a drawer without being able to read, but clear, plain, set out properly. Brown sugar shortbread, always double the vanilla. Trust me. Rosalie went through page after page. Her mother had written notes in the margins throughout. Small observations, substitutions, opinions delivered as fact. Dad hates cloves. I use them anyway. She read until she reached the last page, a recipe for apple cake passed down from her grandmother, with a note in Diane's handwriting at the bottom. Make this with whoever you love most. It takes longer than it needs to, but that's the point. She closed the folder carefully. She didn't cry in the reading room. She waited until she was home. The February concert was a Saturday evening. Rosalie arrived early to walk the stage with the lights up full, learning the dimensions by moving through them. 7 steps from the wings to the piano bench, the corner of the bench to the right, the music stand she wouldn't need, because she'd known the piece since she was 12. The room was small and warm. The lighting coordinator had consulted with her beforehand and brought everything up to a brightness she'd approved. When the audience settled in, Rosalie sat in the backstage hallway and listened to the sound of coats being removed, of programs unfolding, of low voices finding their seats. Adrian was out there with her husband, a few colleagues from school. She hadn't told anyone else who was coming. She hadn't wanted a crowd to brace against. She walked out when the house lights dimmed, found the bench by the corner of it, the way she'd practiced, sat down. She played Chopin, Opus 9, No. 2. Her hands knew it so completely that the knowing existed somewhere below thought, in muscle, in the specific weight of each finger against the keys. She played it the way she'd heard it on that record in her apartment years ago, with the slight hesitation in the middle passage, the particular gravity in the final chord. The room was quiet, the way a room can only be when people have stopped shifting and simply let something happen to them. When she finished, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The applause started. She didn't look for Hugo in the audience. She didn't look for anything in particular. She sat there, in good light, on a stage she'd memorized and let it reach her. In April, Rosalie booked a seat on the Rocky Mountaineer. The accessible rail journey from Banff through the mountains had a car with priority seating near the windows, and a guide from a disability travel service who met passengers at each stop. She arranged a transfer north to Whitehorse, 2 days after the train's arrival in Vancouver. She'd spent a month planning the trip, speaking to coordinators, confirming every leg. Adrian offered to come. Rosalie thanked her and said she wanted to go alone. The mountains appeared slowly outside the train window, and then all at once, the way things do when you've been watching for a long time, and suddenly stopped trying. She kept her face to the glass. The light changed every hour, morning blue to mid-afternoon gold to the long pale stretch of early evening. She ate in the dining car and struck up a conversation with a retired schoolteacher from Thunder Bay, who had a degenerative hip condition, and was completing a similar kind of list. They compared notes on accessible booking services and fell into an easy silence when the scenery demanded it. The Northern Lights tour out of Whitehorse ran 3 nights. On the second night, the forecast was clear. The van took a small group out past the city lights to an open field bordered by spruce. It was cold enough that Rosalie's breath showed in the beam of someone's headlamp. She stood on a cleared, level stretch of ground. She'd confirmed the terrain with the guide beforehand, no obstacles she hadn't already accounted for, and looked up. The lights came while she was still adjusting to the dark. They began as a faint green shimmer along the northern horizon, and then, over the course of several minutes, expanded into something she had no adequate word for. Curtains of light. Green at the lower edges, shifting to white, then to a pale violet high up, moving with a slowness that felt almost like breathing. They were wide enough that she could see them in her remaining peripheral vision, the edges of them reaching the edges of what she could still see. She stood with her chin tilted up and did not move. Diane had described the Northern Lights once. In the particular way she described things she hadn't actually seen but believed in fully. Like the sky changed its mind about being dark. Rosalie stood in the field for a long time. The cold worked through her coat. No one in the group spoke much. The lights moved and everyone watched them move. She thought of Hugo briefly, not with bitterness, not with the particular ache of wanting him back. She thought of how he would have stood close beside her, with his hand on her arm, his attention divided between her and the sky. How she might have reached the end of this trip feeling grateful for his help, and never once discovering she didn't need it. She looked back up. The sky was enormous above the spruce line. The light shifted along its own logic, unhurried. She had come here the way she and Diane had always meant to come, and she had come standing on her own 2 feet, and the sky was doing exactly what her mother had said it would. She had played the piano. She had read her mother's words. She was standing under lights her mother never got to see. She'd brought herself here, every leg of it, every confirmation call, every form, every conversation with a stranger on a train, all of it had been hers. Not managed for her, not decided in advance by someone who loved her and was afraid. Hers. The light moved. The cold settled. Somewhere behind her, a woman said something soft to the person beside her, and the person beside her laughed, just quietly. Rosalie stayed until the guide called them back to the van. She was the last one to turn away from the field.